Welcome to the Meeting 3 video. The goal of this meeting is to open up dialogue about understanding your own culture, recognizing cultural differences, and how to deal with culture stress. Without knowing it, when we travel to other countries, we often expect our hosts to bend to our cultural needs because we don't realize the differences at play. At the end of this meeting, you will not be a cultural expert, but you will have new language to process what you experience. The time for this material, this section is about 60 minutes. As with all the sections, this is not comprehensive material. On some pages, you'll see references for further reading. If you have questions, feel free to contact me. As an opening exercise, take 5 minutes to quickly complete the Proverbs page. This is meant to be fun, thinking about the ways that we say things. It may also be a helpful reminder that the way we say things is very culturally bound. Remember, if our hosts are translating what we are saying, even if they speak English, there's a chance that the message will be lost or confused. One great thing about this activity is that it reminds us that many cultures have similarities. We're going to spend a lot of our time in this section talking about how cultures are different, and they are. And we shouldn't underestimate how different they are. That often gets us in trouble. But at the same time, we are all human, and there are many things that we can hold in common as well. The people we're connecting with, though culturally different, are people like we are. Defining culture, in this section we start to get a definition to some of the terms we're going to be using. Now there are many definitions for culture. I've chosen one from a Christian anthropologist named Mike Rinkowich. His book is a great addition to any reading on culture. Now it is a long definition, so I would encourage your team to break it up by discussing each term individually. Also, some of the terms relate to later quotes, so make sure that you make those connections. Some questions you might ask are, how are knowledge, values, and feelings different from one another? How are they similar? What does it mean for culture to be an integrated system? Discussing as an integrated system actually relates to the quote from Clifford Geertz that we are a part of webs of significance that we spin ourselves. So we create culture, but it also creates us. How would you describe what he means by culture defines their reality or their worldview? What is someone's worldview? Now, when we believe that our worldview is the only true worldview, that's called ethnocentrism. So look at the quote by Howell and Paris at this point. It's also good to remember, if a culture has survived for thousands of years, as many have, they must be doing something right. So we should be careful to place judgment. Even though what someone does may seem odd to us, it may be an action that fits perfectly into the culture they are part of, a strategy for living that is appropriate for their context. Another question, how does culture help to generate appropriate strategies for living? One way this is done is through cultural conditioning. So what are some social norms and values? Some answers could be like roles of family, kids. Every culture has a different role for how children are to interact with adults. For example, in the United States, in the southern states often teach children to say sir and ma'am, where it is less common in northern states. But also how parents train and raise their kid varies. The role of a job. Is it for fulfillment and purpose, just something to help pay bills for the family, or is it the history of doing something that your family does? Social cues like distance when talking. Japan is an example of this. Social distance is often farther away because of customary bows for greeting. Other cultures have a lot less distance between two people talking. Views of femininity and masculinity. And what are other things that your team can think of? The hope in learning about our culture is so that we can have our eyes opened when we enter cross-cultural settings. Now, the story at the bottom of this page is a true story. The proverb game showed us that sometimes we have similar meanings behind different words and actions. This article shows where a similar action has a very different meaning. On the next page, we have the story of the Nasi Rema. And the goal of this story is to challenge the perspectives and show some of the ways that we make other cultures seem quote-unquote exotic, and then by default that our culture is norm. So read this aloud. It will have more of an impact as people hear each other and react. Now just remember that those things that seem strange in other cultures are not often strange to those within the culture. Questions like, why would anyone eat that, is really not fair, as there could be things that we eat that as an outsider would seem ridiculous. A great way to help us process that is by looking at the next page, an outsider perspective. It's about what others from the outside of the U.S. see of us. It's a fun way to see how others think about Americans. So Make sure you read the dialogue bubble. It's also a good idea, if time permits, to talk about how you ask questions and interact in a way that doesn't demean people. If you have time, there is a hilarious video about ethnocentrism and not listening well to others. It's called Tim's. It's by Tripp and Tyler, and you can find it on YouTube. The cultural values orientation is taken mostly from David Livermore's book, Serving with Eyes Wide Open. Now, this is an important book. It would be a great book to take with you on this journey. Remember, when we talk about these categories, we're painting with broad cultural strokes. So not everyone in a culture fits neatly in this spectrum. In the US, we find people who are like and unlike the categories that we put on the US. But these categories can point to tendencies. Also, let's not create a view of culture as stagnant. It's not. It's constantly changing. So again, though much of these categories are helpful, some are more fluid than others. Globalization and the growing interconnectedness of the world is changing cultures, including ours, dramatically and rapidly. One final note, Livermore breaks this up by country and region, and you'll see that some of the on the next pages with an asterisk by their name. This is because culture is not divided by borders. Our national borders are really a recent invention. Cultures flow over borders, and within borders you can find varying cultures as well. As you go through these, make sure that you mark where you think you fall on the spectrum and where the host country falls. So first is time orientation. It's one of the easiest concepts to begin with. We should be careful not to assume that that means that some people show up on time and some people are late. This is a view of our cultural paradigm which expects time based on a clock. So have you ever heard someone say, if you're on time, you're late? Rather than suggesting that the clock is the determiner of time, some cultures use other clues, like when everyone has arrived and they all feel the time is right, that's when you start. So some examples of this. One time, though it's actually happened on multiple occasions, but one time when we arrived at a church in Mexico for a service, at the time that we were told to arrive, the lights in the church weren't even on. If I didn't have someone directing me to the church and a big sign that said Iglesia de Dios, or Church of God, I would have assumed we were in the wrong church. We waited and then finally sent a person to go to the church and see if we were where we were supposed to be or if we were in fact in the wrong place. Well, no. The pastor and his family were just starting to get ready. We were in the right place. They turned on the lights for us and went back to preparing. Now, if we think that we were on time, the question might be asked, why were we the only ones to think that it started at 7 o'clock? Did others think that they should come late? Well, maybe. Probably more likely, the others knew that they knew each other well, and they knew that they would start when everyone got there. And if someone's aunt dropped by for dinner and took longer than expected, everything would wait a little bit. It's a matter of what gets priority. Now notice I didn't say it's a matter of right or wrong. If you live in the US, which functions on clock orientation, and you show up an hour late to work every day, there is a good chance that you will not have a job for very long. Another reason why things like fit and culture are so important when hiring. For instance, when a college student in the US stumbles into class unshowered and disheveled and claims they are on event orientation, you can kindly remind them that others came to class at the culturally appropriate time. The next piece is context. Context refers to the shared history people have in a certain place. So high context refers to a place where people have a long history together, and low context refers to a short history. Now this can be hard to grasp as the US is such a low context culture. Here's an example of what a high context might look like. So a missionary friend of mine from Macedonia told a story of hearing a family talk about an issue that they had with another family that was living in the same community. The family went on about how this other family had done them wrong and how the rift had caused them to ignore each other. The missionary found out later that the rift happened hundreds of years prior, but they talked about it as if it were present. Now this is one view of what context, a shared history of a people, and how we experience that history can look like. Now with a short history, the United States has a very low context. Related to context is another piece that's indirect and direct communication. High context cultures tend to communicate in very indirect ways. The meaning is found in the context. Where low context cultures tend to communicate in more direct ways, so the meaning is found in the words. A missionary recounted a conversation with an East African woman that had been put in charge of an initiative that they were starting. When the missionary met with the woman, she kept asking questions about the role, about expectations, etc. Sensing there was more to her questions, he asked, What are you asking? Are you interested in leading the initiative? And she responded, no, not really. Now, this is a simplistic example, but in many cultures, it's not appropriate to ask a direct question or to make a direct statement. You ask questions or make statements that let the other person know what you're trying to say culturally. That is why listening and asking questions in response is so important. The next piece is collectivist. Collectivist refers to one's primary source of identity. Community, or high collectivist, or individual, low collectivist. Again, don't get into a battle of good or bad. This is simply the way that we are conditioned culturally. Now, you may have heard the story about a village coming to Christ after the chief or the leader accepted Christ. We often shirk at this because to us, our faith is totally personal. But again, that stems from a belief that my identity is found in myself and not tied to others. Now, this is not to say that as a low collectivist society that we never think of others when we make decisions. That's obviously not true, but our culture, the U.S. culture as a whole, is not collectivist. For instance, when someone graduates from high school, they are often asked, where are you going to study? Where are you going to college? This in itself is individual in nature. The person decides to go where they want to go. Maybe they have some input from family, but they get a major stake in that decision. For communities that are high collectivist society, the decision will be made for them, and it would be made for the benefit of the community. So rather than the question, where are you going to study, it may be expressed as, where are we going to study? The next piece is power distance, and this refers to the social distance between leaders and followers. Countries with high power distance give significant respect to leaders and status and titles, and those are important. Now, one way to think about this is language is a powerful component of culture. So think about in Spanish. There are two words for the pronoun you. They are tú and usted. When I'm speaking to someone who's my age or younger, or who I have a higher status than, I would use the familiar term tú. But when speaking with someone of a higher status, I use the word usted. Another example of this is found in Scripture. So as a group, you can look up Mark 10, 35 through 45. In some cultures, the most important person must enter the room last. In these verses, we see James and John vie for the seats next to Jesus, which in that culture is a sign of status. The final piece is uncertainty avoidance. And this is the extent to which a culture is at ease with risk and unpredictability. So countries high in uncertainty avoidance have little toleration for ambiguity or the unknown. Predictability is key. David Livermore tells a story about teaching in Singapore. He taught there for many years and said that it was not unusual to be contacted 12 to 15 times asking for more detailed information about what he was going to teach. Now, Singapore is a country with a high need for structure. Now, this is something to be aware of when planning a trip. Sometimes you may work with those who are comfortable with open-ended scheduling, and other times it may be a frustration to you or possibly to the host that there is not more structure. So communicating this is key. And ask questions and listen well. One final note about this page. This page probably includes the newest terminology of any page in the training. So don't get bogged down just trying to learn each of these concepts thoroughly. Don't be overwhelmed. The goal here is to realize how much there is about culture that we may not ever have been aware of. And truly, this is simply the tip of the iceberg, and it's constantly changing. The goal here is to give some new language, to open some new compartments mentally where things can be stored while you're traveling. The estimates of cultural orientation, on this page you'll find where different cultural groups or countries fall on the spectrum. Take some time to see if you placed the cultural groups in the right place. The Bible and culture. This is an important concept. Oftentimes we think of our faith that it somehow transcends culture, as if the ways that we understand our faith is the same way as people for hundreds of years prior, and that current cultural values don't play a part in the way that we understand our faith. Have someone read Matthew 5, 44 and 45. Now answer the question, what does the phrase "sends the rain on the righteous and unrighteous" mean? Usually people will talk about how good and bad things happen to all people, or God sends good things and bad things to good people and bad people. It's interesting to know that in some African cultures, rain is not looked at as a negative or a depressing thing as it often is portrayed in American culture. In fact, rain is seen as a blessing. So rather than suggesting that God sends bad things to all people, this passage reminds African readers that God blesses all people. Even simple passages can be read differently in different cultures. This is important to realize that even the way we read the Bible is culturally bound. What other verses might be like this? On the final page, we look at issues around culture stress. First, a definition. Culture stress is anxiety with being in a cross-cultural context. Now, I've always thought about it as my emotions were on a spectrum. If I hold my hands out, my shoulder to shoulder, that's the length of my normal high moments and my normal low moments in my home culture. Now, when I travel, that spectrum is stretched. My highs seem a little bit higher and my lows a little bit lower. For me, I feel everything more intensely. Others experience stress differently, but oftentimes it's in the normal day-to-day things that people have the most frustration. So this is often related to higher and lower ways of thinking. So we adjust our lives towards rituals, and those rituals allow us to forget about things. For example, we can spend time thinking about what's next on our schedule when we're brushing our teeth in the morning. We aren't actively evaluating how we're brushing our teeth. But when we are in a new environment, and especially one with foreign ways of doing things, our rituals get thrown off. So we spend more time on lower thinking rituals and then try and fit in our higher thinking at other times, which makes us exhausted. Have you ever felt more tired than usual when you travel? Well, you're making more decisions, your brain is navigating more thoughts, and you're trying to understand what's going on in ways that you don't have to in your home culture. So it's not uncommon when you're brushing your teeth and suddenly you realize that you just used the tap water and you weren't supposed to, and you start to lose it a little and ask, why is the water like that anyway? Just know that many people feel like that at some point. The key is knowing why you feel that way. It's not the water, it's that life is very different and exhaustion gets to us. Give yourself and others some grace. As you travel, you may experience culture stress differently. There are 3 phases. 1, everything is new and exciting. Newer things are fun and interesting. The food is different. But because you're only there for a couple weeks, you can really push through it. Most people, because of the short time they travel, will never leave this first phase. It's always neat and fun. The next phase is where everything is no longer fun. The things that brought you joy in your home country are gone. Everything is awful. Oftentimes, this phase comes around 3 to 6 months. It's a tough time. People get extremely homesick and tired and frustrated with life. So unless you are going for an extended time, you probably won't get much into this phase. But remember, your friends living cross-culturally, call them between the 3 and 6 month mark and offer some support because they're most likely going through this. Finally, the last phase, there's a new sense of release from those frustrations. You start to learn how to get around the differences in the culture. You're not idealistic about things and issues, but you know how to live in a comfortable way. Though you may only be in the first phase, you may encounter a missionary that is at a very different place. Remember, missionaries are people with families and friends that are giving up a lot to answer God's call. Listen to them and know that the choices they are making are not easy ones. Finally, it's good to think about how you will deal with the stress that you may encounter. Again, you may not notice the stress much at all, or it may be difficult for you to bear. It really depends on each person's life circumstance. So here are some good, simple things that you can do. Give yourself space and allow others to have space when they ask for it. If someone is totally cutting themselves off and is hiding in their room, then make sure that you ask them questions and engage them. But if they just need an hour alone, give it to them. They may emerge in a much better place. 2, ask good questions. If you're confused by something, ask questions in a non-threatening way. Others on your trip can be a good sounding board for questions. Number 3, get rest. Get sleep as much as you can. That doesn't mean that you should call it a night at 7 p.m. when church starts at 7:30 because you're tired, but when you can sleep, do it. 4th, be open to change and learning. Your attitude on the trip and the self-talk you give yourself will make a world of difference in your experience. Next, get involved. Sometimes you don't need to ask questions. You just need to jump in, to eat with people, to talk with people. Or if you can't speak their language, just sit with them. Be a part. Now, I end with a question about the strategies you have. I think it's good to talk through ways and strategies you have of engaging. So everyone is different, and what some people might suggest might be useful for others. Thanks for listening, and safe travels.